Hey, what's up? This is Leo for Actualized.org, and in this video what I want to talk about is the idea of giving advice. And this is an interesting topic because I've always been fascinated about this idea of advice being important, and advice being something that you can get a lot from in your life, and as a good way of improving your life. But there's also this problem with giving advice, especially giving advice to other people. And there's also challenges with giving advice to yourself. But the challenge with giving advice to other people is that a lot of times I'll see people trying to give advice to others and it not registering. And in fact, it almost backfiring. So what's a good example of this? Well, for example, a parent giving advice to a child. A lot of times what I'll see, the standard naive tendency is to be able to say, well, I know what's best for that person because I have more experience than they do. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give them some advice. And then you share that advice and you see that it's not really working. And so what you tend to do is you're like, okay, well, I'm going to get even more stern with the advice. It's like they're not hearing it. It's not registering. So I'm going to even give that advice in a stronger way. I'm going to really jam that advice down their throat. And when you do that, you can almost see, you can kind of predict what's going to happen, is that there's almost like a rebellion that happens there. There's a tendency to not want to take that advice or to take that advice for granted. I think what's important here is, and this is especially an important video for parents, is that you have to realize that it's one thing to understand something logically, it's a totally different thing to really integrate it and understand it emotionally. And so there's that aspect that you're forgetting when you're trying to ram advice down someone's throat. When you're trying to give someone advice, first of all, there's a couple of problems here. One problem is that their values are not identical to your values. So, and there could be quite a big disparity between the values of the person you're giving advice to and your own values, and their situation and your situation. So what you feel as being the right advice for them might not actually be very good advice, because advice is not applicable at the same time to everybody. There's specific points in your life where certain advice is good and certain advice is not good. And there's specific advice that's good for some people that's not good for other people. So just assuming that everyone has the same values as you and wants the same things and wants to approach things in the same way and learns in the same fashion that you learned is already a problem. That person that you're giving advice to might be on a different wavelength, and that advice just might not register. The other challenge here is that you have to really take to heart and think back and ask yourself, how did you learn these lessons, right? Because there's a tendency, especially for parents, to say, well, I struggled, I had to make these horrible mistakes. I had to go through years of pain and struggle to learn this valuable lesson. And now what I want to do is I want to kind of distill that lesson after all that knowledge, and I want to hand it down to my kids. I want to say, look, I went through a horrible divorce. I went through a horrible job. I went through horrible medical problems. I went through all these scenarios, and I learned these valuable lessons. And I have these regrets. If I knew everything that I know now, I would have handled the situations totally differently. And so, why should I watch my kid go through the same problems? I don't want you to go through those same pains. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share these stories with you, and I'm going to distill these golden nuggets and hand them down to you. And then what you're going to do is you're going to take that golden nugget and you're going to say, yeah, that's an amazing insight. And then you're going to go off and you're going to live your life perfectly without having to go through all these challenges and these roadblocks that I went through. And that sounds really good. The intention behind that is great. Except the problem is that when you're using that kind of strategy, what you're forgetting is that the way that you learned those lessons is through the struggle. And you're discounting and underestimating how important and how critical that struggle was to you internalizing those lessons. Because those lessons, if you feel a need to really share those lessons with others, those are probably not lessons that you learned in a book. Those are lessons that you got because you went through some hard knocks in your life. And experience has really emotionalized those lessons for you. Because what happened was that you felt extreme pain or extreme pleasure, a sense of joy, elation when you went through some of these experiences. And what that literally did is it seared the lessons in your brain. Whereas now, if you take that and you just take the logical bits of that lesson and you hand it down to somebody, it's not going to be the same thing. So you have to really appreciate how much the experience of it, and especially the struggle, how important that was to learning the lesson. And the best lessons in life, as the old saw goes, are learned through experience. They're not learned through a book, and they're not even learned from your religious leaders or from your parents or from your teachers or from your mentors. You can get some value from that kind of advice, but it's not going to be nearly as powerful as when it's internalized. And I think that parents and other people that are trying to give advice to other people need to recognize this really important fact. I know personally, as myself, as being a life coach and being a student of personal development and having read, literally hundreds of books and gone to expensive seminars on this stuff, it's very easy for me to see what somebody's doing in their life. And I have this tendency to say, well, I've studied this stuff. I know that you can get a lot better result if you just did X or if you just did Y, if you just tweaked your approach this way. And so there's a real tendency and drive on my part to just give advice to people. And a lot of times that advice is really good, but I also have to recognize that just because it is objectively good advice and the research supports it and the books support it and my own experience supports it and the experience of my clients support it, that doesn't mean that this is the right advice for this person. And it doesn't mean it's the right time for this person to hear this advice. And it also doesn't mean that I can shortcut their learning process, right? That's the most important thing, is that you have to realize that some people just need to struggle through things to really understand them, to internalize them. You can't just hand down advice and expect it to be registered at the same level that it did to you because of your experiences. And so when I think about that, when I reflect on that, I tend to calm down. I tend to say, you know what, I don't need to be giving advice all the time. I can ask prodding questions. That's what coaches tend to do. It tends to be a better approach, is to ask deep questions that make the other person think more than just hand them down advice and a list of things to do. Because when you ask them questions, that gets them thinking. That gets them reevaluating what they're doing with their life. And in that case, it tends to be a better way to create a change. Because when the person understands for themselves and generates the answer for themselves, they're more invested in it. They have the motivation to follow up with it, to take action on it, rather than when you handed that thing down to them. So I think it's really important to watch out for this this tendency to want to shortcut people's learning curves, and to say that you don't want people to struggle, because struggle is important. It's a big part of life, and the way that we become rounded human beings, the way that we really learn and we gain wisdom, is by going through the struggle of life. That's what's really rewarding. So obviously, that doesn't mean that you want to let people commit horrible mistakes and do things that would really damage them. But as long as you're protecting your friends and your children or people that you're mentoring, as long as you're protecting them from making just really stupid decisions that have very drastic consequences, then you want to kind of give them the freedom to go around there and explore for themselves. And even when you see that they're going down the wrong path, maybe you can question them on it a little bit, get them to think about it, because sometimes people go down the wrong path because they're not even conscious. They don't even know what they're doing. But a lot of times people just choose to go down a path because they genuinely believe that it's right for them. And maybe it even is at the time. They need to explore it. They need to see if it fits with them. And so if that's the case, let them do a little bit of that exploring. Don't feel like you need to stop them and impart your wisdom onto them. Let them do that exploring and trust that they have resourcefulness and that they have intellect, and that they're going to be able to realize that if something's not working for them in the long run, they're going to change their approach. And then that maybe they'll come back to you and say, you know what, I've really gone down this path that I thought would work well for me, but it hasn't. And maybe you could share now some of your advice about how you also struggled through the same problem and made it work for you. And that is going to help, because then you're not taking that kind of frame where you're saying, well, I told you so. You don't want to really do that. What you want to do is you want to say, yeah, you know what, I knew that you were kind of going down the wrong path, but I didn't want to be pushy about it, because I realized that it's important for you to try out and make errors, and that errors are not bad. Errors are ways that we learn. This is how we build wisdom. This is how we build experience. And so those are all valuable lessons that you learn as you're going through life. So if you are someone who is very advice giving, If you are someone who's working in an advice-giving profession, or if you have children, or if you have even parents, older parents that you're giving advice to, realize how advice works. Realize that you have this tendency to want to shortcut people's learning curves, and that that's not always the best thing. All right, so this is going to be it for this video. As always, I look forward to your comments, hearing from you. Contact me, let me know what kind of content you'd like me to make for you, and also let me know what you think about this stuff and any questions that you have, and what your experiences are with giving advice.